Greetings, debaters. This is Dr. Ryan Galloway again, and this is the third lecture on the death penalty, and it's debating the death penalty on the negative. What do you do against the death penalty case? I'm going to divide my lecture into four parts. The first are the disadvantages to abolishing the death penalty. The second are counterplans you can run against the death penalty affirmative. Third are critiques you can run against the death penalty affirmative. And fourth are answering the advantages of the death penalty affirmative. So disadvantages. I'm going to talk about the deterrence disadvantage, but to do that, I'm going to talk about the four primary purposes of the criminal justice system. Why do we punish people? Why do we make it to where if you do something wrong that you face some kind of punishment? And there are four basic answers to that question. The first is you might want to deter people. You might want to stop them from committing crimes. Someone sees that someone was punished for committing the crime, so they think to themselves before committing the crime, I don't want to commit that crime because I'm going to be punished in some way. And the death penalty in some ways is sort of the ultimate deterrent. My goodness, if I commit murder, I'm going to be put to death. My life will literally end. And so in theory, at least, the death penalty is a very powerful deterrent because people see that if they commit murder, that they'll be put to death, and therefore they don't commit murder. The second reason why you might punish someone is you might want to incapacitate them. You might want to prevent them from committing a crime while they're being punished. So for prison, this means that as long as someone is in prison, they can't go and commit another crime. So if someone committed a burglary, if they robbed a store, if you put them into prison, then they can't rob a store as long as they're in prison. Well, the death penalty is sort of the ultimate incapacitation. If you're put to death, you can never kill someone again. And so the death penalty also serves the purpose of incapacitating people. We also punish to get retribution or to get justice for the victims of the crime. So the victims' families, those that are close to the victim, they're going to go through a lot of pain and suffering because of the crime that was committed against them. So to give them a sense of justice, we have retribution. We want to punish the person that committed the crime. And again, as you can imagine, the death penalty is the ultimate retribution. These people know that, hey, I know my family suffered, but this person suffered too. They suffered the ultimate penalty. They suffered the death penalty for what they did. So now I have a feeling that I am whole again, or at least I'm on the path to being whole again. A fourth reason we punish people is to rehabilitate them. We send them to prison in order that they become a better person, and then when they come out, they don't commit crimes anymore. The term for committing a crime again is recidivism, and we try and prevent recidivism by rehabilitating people. Well, this is one thing the death penalty doesn't do. The death penalty doesn't care if you're rehabilitated or not. The death penalty's solution to recidivism is to kill you, and therefore you can't ever commit the crime again. I mention these things because you might run into these purposes of the criminal justice system, and the purpose of this disad is deterrence. So the way you'd run the disad is you'd say crime is low in the present system. And this may surprise you, and it surprises a lot of people when they're polled, but crime has been dropping in the United States for the last quarter of a century. We both have been decreasing the amount of prison that we use, and crime has been going down for a quarter of a century. Murders are down, robberies are down. Unfortunately, one crime that has bucked the trend is rape, but other crimes on the whole are down, especially murder. Then you would argue the death penalty deters crime. And I can't do the amount of literature on this question justice in just the short time period that I have with you. There have been numerous in-depth studies on the question of whether or not the death penalty deters crime. You will find some studies from researchers at Emory University that say that the death penalty saves about 7 or 8 lives for each execution because criminals fear the death penalty. And there are examples where criminals will commit a crime in such a way as to try and avoid the death penalty. So they commit a robbery, but they don't use a gun because they're afraid they might kill someone and get put to death. Criminals plea bargain to where they won't be put to death. So criminals think more rationally than you think they do. And they don't want to get put to death, so they won't commit capital crimes. Then you can claim some various impacts from crime. You can claim the economy, that crime undermines the economy. Obviously, if there's widespread crime, people don't want to invest in communities. Housing prices go down when there's a lot of crime in neighborhoods. And again, I mentioned before that I'm barely scratching the surface on the amount of literature on this question, but there's another wealth of literature that studies the economic effects of high crime rates. And high crime rates are associated with a decline in the economy. You can also claim terrorism. First of all, the death penalty is specifically used against terrorists. One of the reasons why we have the death penalty and we're pursuing the execution of the Boston Marathon bomber is to prevent those kinds of things from occurring. But there's actually evidence that even low-scale criminals get involved with terrorism, and that one of the solutions to terrorism is to solve petty crimes. And then you can claim that you actually save more innocent lives than you kill. The various studies indicate anywhere from 7 to 16 innocent people are saved every time we use the death penalty. And the reason why: criminals fear death, and they won't use lethal force if they're afraid they're going to get the death penalty. The next disad is the elections disad, which will probably be the biggest and best disad on the topic until the election on November 3rd. And the way this disad would work is that Biden will win the election right now. There are a lot of things dragging Trump down. The first is the coronavirus. People argue he hasn't responded well to the coronavirus, and a lot of people have died who otherwise wouldn't have died. The second is the economy, that the shutdowns in the economy have caused widespread unemployment, which bodes ill for Trump's chances of re-election. And the third is Trump's reaction to the George Floyd protests. He's been a law and order president. He hasn't embraced Black Lives Matter, and most of America have embraced the protesters and are on the side of the protesters. So Trump needs a new story. He needs something to happen that's popular with people in order to win the election. And banning the death penalty is popular. First, there's been a move of public opinion polls in the United States that say people prefer life without parole to the death penalty. And the reason why is because people are believing some of the affirmative arguments. People are believing that innocent people die. People are believing that the death penalty is used in a racist manner, and therefore it can be popular to ban the death penalty. Even greater than this, however, is the unique popularity banning the death penalty would have in various swing states. So for you, those of you that followed the election last time around, you would know that Trump did not win the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. Actually, about 3 million people more voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. But those people were concentrated in liberal states like California and New York and the West Coast, and they weren't concentrated in the states that actually mattered for the election, which were Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Well, various death penalty organizations do state-level polling, and in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, and Wisconsin, the death penalty is unpopular. A lot of those states have banned the death penalty, and therefore it would be popular if the federal government went ahead and banned the death penalty. And so Trump would have something that is popular in the swing states to talk about and to divert attention from all of the problems going on right now. And there's also evidence that says he needs something that appeals to Sanders voters, that actually about 1 out of 10 Sanders voters voted for Trump last time. So if he can have a nice progressive liberal policy like banning the death penalty, he could get those voters on his side. And the impacts to that are warming, that Trump does not care about global warming, that 4 more years of Trump will put us past the tipping points on global warming, and nuclear proliferation, that our allies are scared that Trump is going to abandon them and they will build their own nuclear weapons, and that they think that the last 4 years was just a blip in the system. It was an aberration. That's not actually what the American people think. The American people actually have their back. But that if Trump were to win again, they would realize that the American people don't support their allies, and they would have no choice but to build nuclear weapons. And that just scratches the surface of the number of impacts you can claim from Donald Trump winning the election. And so you ought to easily be able to say that it is far more important for international stability and all of these international advantages that the affirmative claims that Trump loses than one little policy like the death penalty gets rid of. That's not going to affect us on the world stage as much as who the leader of the country is, and especially if you believe what some people say about Trump, that he has just been a disastrous president for the various policies that the United States has tried to promote. I'm not going to talk about the various courts' disadvantages in this lecture. I have another lecture series which is going to be dedicated to the courts. But if the plan operates through the Supreme Court, then a wide variety of options opens up to you for arguments you can make against those cases. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about counterplans. The first is the state's counterplan. And if you recall from the affirmative lecture, 28 states have the death penalty. You could just have them eliminate the death penalty. And there's a good amount of literature that says states are eliminating the death penalty right now. They're on the general move to eliminate the death penalty. So you can find solvency advocates for eliminating the death penalty. Well, then you have that problem of there's still the federal death penalty in place. Fiat gymnastics aside, the federal death penalty is barely used. The last time someone was put to death via the federal death penalty was in 2003. Now, Trump is trying to increase executions now for the federal death penalty, but we're talking about 4 or 5 individuals that he would put to death. The notion that the federal death penalty is this huge international signal is false because there are only a couple of people that it affects. It is barely used. It is an anachronism. It is something that is on the books but is just simply not enforced. Constitutional amendment counterplan. So if the affirmative operates through the courts, probably the #1 strategy used at the college level against courts AFF is to pass a constitutional amendment against the affirmative. And the constitutional amendment counterplan sort of puts the affirmative in a tricky place, because the best answer to the constitutional amendment counterplan is to say that we shouldn't trivialize the Constitution with amendments that junk up the Constitution, that the difference between the federal Constitution and the state constitutions is that the federal Constitution has fewer amendments that reflect more broad principles, and that when you begin to get into specific amendments to the Constitution, like putting in traffic tickets, banning particular crimes, etc., that it makes the Constitution look worthless. The problem is that the affirmative can't really claim that their AFF is worthless or irrelevant. Keep in mind what the affirmative has already claimed. They have already claimed that the affirmative is such a big deal and such an international signal that other nations will not go along with us unless we get rid of the death penalty. So instead of doing one Supreme Court decision, why not enshrine it in the Constitution for all times, for all people to see what the effects are? There's a lot of debating about how the constitutional amendment goes against courts AFs, which I'll talk more about in the courts lecture. But keep in mind that the constitutional amendment counterplan is very powerful against court AFs. There are also various picks you can run against court AFs or plan-inclusive counterplans. You could narrow but not eliminate the death penalty, so you could keep it for just terrorists or just drug traffickers. You could increase procedural protections for the innocent. You could give them more appeals. You could change evidentiary standards to make it easier for people to be proven innocent. And if you wanted to go really hardcore, you could expedite the death penalty and make sure people on death row are killed to increase the deterrent value of the death penalty. You wouldn't solve any of the AF, but you'd provide uniqueness for your deterrence disad. Critiques. I think critiques are probably where a lot of people are going to go against the death penalty AF. The death penalty is hard to debate on its merits, but if you can pull them further left and say that getting rid of the death penalty will justify life in prison, then you can go further left and say we ought to be abolishing prison altogether. So there's a really interesting article entitled Into the Abyss, the Unintended Consequences of Abolishing the Death Penalty, which is used a lot in the negative section of the packet, that if the alternative to the death penalty is life without parole, then the death penalty justifies heinous actions. So life without parole is no picnic. And in fact, it can actually be worse for you than the death penalty because there are less procedural protections if you get life without parole. You're going to die in prison because you've been given life without parole. There are people who would rather be put to death than get the death penalty, that would rather get the death penalty than to be put in prison for the rest of their lives. So this is a really heinous thing that takes place. You're saying it's okay to punish people with life without parole. It's just not okay to put them to death with the death penalty. But it's justified. The criminal justice system is justified by getting rid of the death penalty. And getting rid of the death penalty makes the criminal justice system look fair. Hey, look, we had this unfair component of the criminal justice system. We got rid of it, and now everything's okay. Well, that kind of logic is at the heart of the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. That it's not just one thing. It's overall racism that's spread throughout the criminal justice system. It's not just one cop. It's systemic racism that's taking place within the system. And we need to get rid of this system altogether. And the link cards are pretty good on the idea that getting rid of the death penalty and substituting it for life without parole is only going to make things worse. Plus, focusing on innocence diverts attention from an attack on the justice system as a whole. So if you say we shouldn't punish them because they're innocent, then you're saying it's okay to punish someone if they were guilty. It is only because they were innocent that they should not be punished. But perhaps we shouldn't be using the horrible, torturous criminal justice system to punish anyone. And we ought to be focusing on solving the root causes of crime. And I'm not going to go into the full details of the abolition critique in this lecture. I'm going to give a critique lecture that provides information about the abolition critique, but just know that there are really good cards against the death penalty on it justifying the criminal justice system and it trading off with the move to abolish prisons as a whole. Then there's Afro-pessimism. Getting rid of the death penalty won't make things better for black people. If you got rid of the death penalty, you would just substitute it for life in prison or life without parole, which would still be applied in a racist manner. And again, I'm not going to go in depth on this, but Frank Wilderson has just written, a lead Afro-pessimism author, has just written his book called Afro-pessimism. It's sitting by my nightstand right now, and as soon as I get done doing the various debate things I have to do, I plan on reading it. But I can assure you that a lot of people will be very excited to read brand new cards on Afro-pessimism. Then there's critical legal studies. You make the law look fair. The law is not neutral. The law is used against people of different races and different classes, and it's used to justify the elite system, and we shouldn't spray paint the law and make it look fair. You might hear a variant of this called legalism. I basically think this is the same argument, that you shouldn't focus on the law and you should instead focus on grassroots movements. But I know debaters well enough to know that they'll say, oh, you answered critical legal studies and not legalism, and they're totally different, I promise. So you need to be aware of the notion that people will say we ought to use grassroots movements to make social change instead of using the law. There's another topic-specific critique that was popular the last time we had a criminal justice topic, which is disciplinary power, or Foucault. That power will pop up in another way. That alternatives to the death penalty will be expanded to people that weren't even going to get the death penalty to begin with. So there's a phenomenon called net widening, which is a criminological theory that says that when you substitute one punishment for another, that the substitute punishment will actually be used against more people than it was originally intended to be used against. And so whatever alternative to the death penalty that the affirmative provides will be used against more and more people. I guarantee you the affirmative is not going to want to talk about their alternative. Because if their alternative is life without parole or life in prison, life without parole and life in prison are really bad. It is very heinous in prison. Meanwhile, if they decide that they're going to go really hippie left and say, what's the alternative to the death penalty? And you say, oh, I don't know, maybe no punishment at all, maybe we need to get rid of prison, something like that, then you'll be crushed by the elections disad, because people will for sure say, well, that would be massively unpopular if you just let people who committed murder against someone to go free. So the affirmative is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Are they going to defend an alternative to the death penalty, or are they not going to talk about their alternative and get beat up from the policy arguments that the policy teams will want to run? And if you're a flexible team, you can take advantage of the affirmative from either direction. Now I'm going to talk about answering the advantages. And so the affirmative is going to claim that innocent people are put to death via the death penalty. Well, one sort of easy answer related to the deterrence disad is that the death penalty in fact saves innocent lives via deterrence. If someone is deterred from killing someone, then the person that they killed was an innocent person. And so as long as you can look at the world from a utilitarian perspective, then you'd be in good shape. Now, Kleinstuber, in the article I mentioned before, says that it's actually better for the innocent to get the death penalty and to be put on death row than it is for them to be put in life in prison. And the reason why is because there are a lot of procedural protections in place for the death penalty. There are a lot of appeals that you get. There's a lot of extra lawyering that you get. There's a lot of focus on your case that you get that you wouldn't get if you were put to just life in prison. And so Kleinstuber argues that it is just as heinous to be put in prison in life without parole as it is to be put to death. And therefore, if you are more likely to be proven innocent because of the procedural protections, then you are better off, if you are actually innocent, being put on death row, where you probably won't be killed anyway, than you would be put in life in prison. And then you want to argue that life in prison is as bad, if not worse, than death. And we don't have time to discuss all of the philosophical intricacies of quality of life versus bare life, but you can begin to think about some of those things. Racism. Any alternative to the death penalty will be applied in a racist manner. Life in prison without parole is also applied in a racist manner. So while it may seem like you're doing a good thing by getting rid of something that is put in a racist manner, you're just replacing one racist system with another. Unless you get rid of the core of the criminal justice system, which is rotten and causes racism, then you're just going to be moving around deck chairs on the Titanic. The system must be uprooted and not cosmetically changed. There's evidence specific to the death penalty on this. There's evidence in the Afro-pessimism literature which says you're not really making things better for black people, and what you're doing is a form of cruel optimism where black people think things are going to be better for them when in fact they are not. Fundamental right to life. Well, rights can be outweighed. And one thing you for sure want to argue is that governments are different than individuals. While I, as a person, probably should deontologically not do certain bad things, like I should not steal, I should not kill, I should not lie, that governments are different than people, and they have to balance the good with the bad. And sometimes governments have to do things like engage in international relations with countries that don't have very good human rights records in order to solve a war or to solve global warming or to get people out of prison. And governments have to operate differently than individuals. And plus, if you win that it's okay to be utilitarian, you can just say more lives outweigh less lives, and our disadvantages outweigh your affirmative. International human rights law answers. Well, first of all, there's a debate as to whether or not human rights promotion causes conflict or stops conflict. And you can say that imposing the Western model of human rights on nations that don't traditionally follow a Western model is only going to lead to big-time trouble. You may be familiar with the Arab Spring, where a bunch of nations around the world started fighting for democracy and started fighting for human rights. And once the genie got unleashed from the bottle, people started electing leaders that were against human rights and against the Western model. So human rights promotion from the West can lead to conflict in countries that do not follow that Western model. Plus, there are some authors that just say human rights is a vague, it's an ambiguous term. No one knows what it means. Nations will say they're the best human rights protectors in the world when actually they're really abusive, and thus they're worthless. Plus, international cooperation, probably not going to happen. Nations operate in their own best interest. The reason why nations don't cooperate with each other is because they're looking out for their best interest. Or we can call this the fallacy of the group project. If you're like many debaters, you hate group projects because you realize that you're the one that's going to be doing all the work while other people free ride on you. And so if you're a nation that wants to be a slacker. You're going to let other nations take the responsibility for solving most of the problems. You're going to operate in your own best interest. I'm not going to hurt my economy to stop global warming. I'm not going to invest a lot of money in solving international terrorism. I'm not going to increase the amount of money I give to our alliance because other nations will fill in the gap for me. So they will free ride on you and the nations that do follow international law, and they will not follow it themselves. And then, of course, you'd want to provide some defense against specific scenarios like warming or terrorism, or argue that your elections dissent turns those scenarios. Democratization. There are so many problems with U.S. democracy right now. In my heart of hearts, I am very much an optimist about the United States of America. I believe in liberty, I believe in freedom, I believe in the signal that we send. We have seen better days. Trump threatens democracy. He comes out and says that he's going to prevent the governors from shutting down their economies. One second he's pro the states, the next second he's against the states. He says, without evidence, that elections have been stolen. He won't invest in electoral safety. He is a real signal that is a lot bigger than getting rid of one act on the international stage. Plus, campaign finance threatens democracy. Elections are bought and sold because people can give as much money as they want to candidates. There are political action committees that give money to candidates. There's too much money in politics. Gerrymandering threatens democracy. Gerrymandering is the process whereby governors and state legislators draw election maps to make sure that only candidates of their party get elected. That threatens democracy. Voter suppression. So just this week in the state of Georgia, there were mass allegations of voter suppression, that people were having to walk huge lines around the block in order to vote, and then they would have to wind their way through various places because there were so few voter stations open. And the reason for this is that states are trying to suppress the minority vote because minorities are more likely to vote for Democrats, and so they don't want minorities voting in the first place. After all of that, saying that there's no way on earth the death penalty is the key feature to world democracy, you could challenge whether democracies are actually more peaceful. So the flaw in the literature is the democratic peace theory says that democracies don't fight other democracies. But democracies are very good at fighting non-democracies. Take a look at the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave. In your lifetime, we've invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, all non-democratic nations. In my lifetime, we invaded Panama, we invaded Grenada, we had troops in Lebanon. In a little while back from that, we had Vietnam and we had Korea. This notion that democracies are inherently more peaceful, even if you accept its truth with relation to other democracies, democracies are not more peaceful when it comes to non-democracies. And there's no way the globe is about to reach universal democratization, so you need to be careful about saying democracies are more peaceful. Soft power. Again, focus on Trump. He's decimated soft power. Other countries are laughing at us for all the things that Trump has done internationally. Other nations are looking at his response to the George Floyd protests and saying that he is being utterly ineffective as a leader. You can also argue that even if Trump gained soft power, he wouldn't effectively use it, because he's interested in protecting America first. Then you can argue the benefits of soft power are exaggerated. There's a huge debate in the literature as to whether U.S. leadership solves war or not. An author named Fetweiss has done a lot of studies on this question and argues that U.S. leadership is irrelevant on the world stage in terms of solving conflict, and so you can debate it at that level. You can also argue that the benefits of the liberal international order are exaggerated. While the literature on this is emerging, there are authors who say that the notion that the liberal international order was the reason for the long peace during the Cold War are false, that it was alliances that did it, that it was U.S. hegemony that did it, that it was economic growth that did it, and it wasn't the liberal international order. So, in conclusion, I've given you some disads to death penalty affirmatives. I've given you some counterplans against death penalty affirmatives. I've given you some critiques against death penalty affirmatives, and I've answered the advantage of death penalty AFFs. I am a pragmatist. I believe you should go where you are best at debating, and I think you can beat the death penalty either from the policy side or from the K side. And I think in this instance in particular, being flexible based on what the affirmative tries to argue is the alternative to the death penalty will be a very good way to attack them.